Usually, inculturation has been discussed in the context of contextualization also. Some say that inculturation was not a proper term and preferred contextualization. What's your opinion, and what's the link, or what link do you see between translation and contextualization?
It's one of those incredibly ideological terms. You know all these political movements that got a derogatory term and they picked it up and used it as their identity. In this case, it's sort of working the other way. It did start from, if you like, theories of dynamic equivalence, where they recognized the extreme importance of culture. So it did start from, as an alternative to adaptation, accommodation, everything, okay. But as I've tried to show in that sequence of texts, it has been brought to be a far more lucid view of what happens in cultures, to denying that there is a significant other culture involved, even, that it's the one culture that absorbs the other, and has become a very conservative notion, reinforcing precisely the opposite. So its appeal to me is its power, for good and for bad, depending on where you're positioned within that. The term has become something far more political than the original linguistic problems it might have started from. Okay, so it's become something, a rather different beast over time.
Christopher Larkosh, UMass Dartmouth. Anthony, over in your two talks, we've gotten a lot of reminders about how when we're launching these cultural critiques, they should be critiques that also are directed inward. And you mentioned this again today, and that's a very welcome critique. I see in your work, time and again, we've talked about the United States. We've talked about U.S. monolingualism, point taken. We've talked about the U.S. war machine, point taken. As a linguistic and cultural theorist, these are questions I'm continually pointing inward. And I'd like to ask you how you're pointing inward, because every single critique you've been launching has been towards the United States. And so it's like, you're an Australian, you live in Europe. And so now I want you to walk the walk, Anthony, okay? And I want you to point some very difficult fingers towards your own culture in Australia, because it gets tiresome.
I don't think a culture belongs to a person. I don't think a person belongs to a culture. My problem is I work in the United States. I work in Monterey. I work down the hill from the Defense Language Institute, where these guys are getting trained. I'm every day in the supermarket with these teachers and soldiers doing the language thing. And I'm training the translators and interpreters who are being employed by the damn State Department and the CIA. I have to reflect on exactly, precisely what I'm doing with these people. And as I give them the skills, if you're going to do the translation, please do it well. Give them the real skills. But I feel morally obliged to use this kind of material to make people painfully aware of the wider political context. Now, I'm paid by your government.
As I am paid by
right. Yes. And I'm involved in it. I'm not on the outside, I'm in it. Right. Okay. And I'm not in Australia. I haven't been there for a long time.
Yeah, but that's the culture that you were born into. And
so what?
And you also live in Europe.
Yeah.
It's like, and this U.S. government is not just the U.S. government. It's a much larger, multinational network that we live in.
Sure. Yeah.
And so that we have to look at the ways in which alliances extend beyond the United
Absolutely.
States.
Yes.
Through NATO, through ANZUS.
Australian soldiers are there. More fool them, of course. But they didn't write the counterinsurgency manual.
So these questions of multilingualism
Sure.
have to be extended beyond just this this idea of imperial or power center.
You'll be happy to know that on Friday, I'm going to talk about the status of a sociological study we just finished on the status of translators in Europe and the disastrous situation with respect to immigrant languages in this continent. I mean, I'm not innocent here either. So points well taken. We are on the same team, I hope.
Todd Clayman, National Taiwan Normal University. Anthony, I just was interested to ask, when you talk about a successful enculturation project versus a failed enculturation project, how do you define failure and success in terms of enculturation? Thank you.
That's a good question. I'm nowhere near ready to answer that. As I've engaged in this adventure, I've become painfully aware that I do actually believe in some of the values that are being moved, and I want them to succeed. And so I'm forced into this rather tautological kind of reply. It's successful if I happen to agree with the values that have worked. Okay. Whereas a scholarly reply would have to say, look, you know, the person, that individual contact is a common thing that I'm finding there. And that the brute show of force seems not to work. And that the diglossic thing of H and L over history shows that the cultures that are more successful at enculturation are the ones that occupy the L position. If you know, like the so-called low languages, the language used in the home and the languages of the heart, tend to win out historically over the official languages used in the bureaucracy and the administration and high literature. So you can look at history and get certain lessons about how to enable your enculturation to win out. So those are two different answers. I don't particularly want to give the imperialists the techniques of their craft, but I do want some good values to win out.
James has the next question.
James Maxey, NIDA Institute. I entered my interest in translation through my initial work in enculturation. So that's where I started out. A theological, very narrowly defined idea of enculturation. And now I've seen you expand that idea. I think I'm feeling what I heard you say at the beginning of your lecture about translation and post-translation. So you have taken, at least I heard a narrow definition of translation and your pushback on it being too broadly talked about, and then you taking a very narrowly defined word of enculturation and expanding it dramatically. Do you see any connection between these two movements? The one you agree with, the enculturation expansion, but the expansion into post-translation you're pushing back on?
That's a very good question. I've picked up a term used in a technical sense in another discipline, in another part of the world, and I've seen, hey, this is a model for problems I've got. And so I picked it up and used it. And I should perhaps apologize. But if it works and it's being productive for me at the moment, perhaps something I do can be read back into the narrow theological concern with enculturation. In the same way as the people who are picking up the term translation and using it as a model of all communication or a model between ethnic groups or a model of of communication across history are presenting new insights and problems to the people who work on the narrow concept of translation. I'm never denied that. I'm not easy with some of the intellectual qualities involved in that research, but the presence of vital engaging questions coming from that expansion cannot be denied. Perhaps one day, if anybody else picks up this term enculturation, there might be a similar kind of feedback.
It's fascinating, this expansion and shrinking.
Would you reach this back to Jean-Claude?
Jean-Claude Loba, translation consultant, United Bible Societies. Thank you very much, Professor Pim. I just want to mention that as far as inculturation is concerned, is a huge paradigm, theological paradigm in Africa, the way we talk about liberation theology in Latin America. Therefore, it might be useful or insightful to consider the literature on inculturation from, for instance, School of Kinshasa, people like Bimweni Kweshi, Gindu Mushete, many of them, they wrote a lot on inculturation. And even now, we are moving from inculturation to interculturation, which is also, or intercultural studies, intercultural approach, which is also your trend in terms of research. So if, to the extent that what we call, for instance, the failure for inculturation might not be considered as a failure as such, if it is viewed from intercultural approach. Thank you.
Can you say what you understand by interculturation then?
Okay. Let me just start then from inculturation. The way they understand inculturation is the incarnation of the gospel into a culture, and then incarnation of the gospel into a culture, and then that culture be transformed by the gospel. That's one thing. Now, when we talk about interculturation, it's not only two-way things, it's multiple. In the sense that not only the gospel and the culture, you also take into consideration all the range of other cultures around. That's what we call, for instance, vertical interculturality and horizontal interculturality. Horizontal means that, for instance, if I'm from Congo culture, Congolese culture, I also need to take into consideration what Rwandese culture consider in this particular case. If I'm, for instance, European culture, I also need to negotiate with American culture, for instance. That is horizontality, but there is also a vertical aspect, being, for instance, if it's the gospel, what does the gospel say, for instance, in each Jewish context or in a Greco-Roman context and so on. So that's what now intercultural approach is bringing into this approach, widening the approach which started by inculturation one.
I asked because in the closing lecture on Friday, which deals with sociology, I'll take the inter in a slightly different sense, where I go back to theories of translators as belonging to intercultures, these overlap spaces of professional communicators. So it's good to be clear on terms. I understand the good sense behind the inter that you're using there. I'll be doing it a little differently on Friday, though.
I think we have time for one more question before we move to our photo. Yeah. For the photo, yes.
Thank you, Anthony. Your breadth of knowledge and the scope of your thinking on this matter is quite remarkable. I think we have a lot to learn from Bible translators as well as the U.S. military on concepts of enculturation. It's amazing how they overlap in so many ways. A couple of points of order. The Arizona law, of course, is contested. There's a law, the 1964 Civil Rights Act says that there's no discrimination based upon language of national origin. So these immigrant groups in the United States are fighting this, of course, and it'll probably go to the Supreme Court. It's not, this battle hasn't been resolved, and there are other laws that certainly do allow programs in Latino studies in the United States. And we'll see how that plays out. Let's see, I'm really interested in your work at Monterey. Monterey is not the same as a University of Massachusetts at Dartmouth because Monterey International Language Institute is funded by the Department of Defense. And we have that problem at UMass as well. My board is telling me not to take money from the Department of Defense for teaching of translation. One of our graduates at UMass is teaching at Monterey, and she's teaching Arabic dialectologies so that the communication can improve there. We also, Monterey does not, or at least Monterey or Iowa, or UMass is the only program right now that's taking students into an MA in translation in Arabic. We're getting transfers from Monterey and Iowa and Binghamton. All of these programs, the graduate programs, are dropping Arabic. So I guess my question is to you, in terms of your teaching and your developing programs at Monterey, we find that teaching some translation theory and critical analysis of what it is that one is doing as one participates tends to make you a better translator, whereas some of the trainings are leaving out that critical thinking piece, and I think it's to the detriment of the repertoire that the translator has to solve the interculturation communication problem.
That was Edwin Gensler, UMass Amherst.
I have to be very clear. There are two institutions. There's this big hill up there, the Presidio, and that's the Defense Language Institute, and that's the U.S. Army. That's where they do the stuff. Okay? And down the hill, there's a place called the Monterey Institute of International Studies, which does not work for the Army. It's actually, it was a business that went broke and has been bought by Middlebury College, okay, and we're the lefties. But that is where there is high-level, master's-level training of translators, interpreters, and localization project managers, increasingly, in languages. We had Arabic for 2 years. It didn't work. We didn't get enough enrollments, which is the problem, yeah. So there is this conflict, although I have colleagues who work up the hill, and we have colleagues who went to Baltimore to develop translator training for the, what is the Interagency Intelligence Service. I mean, the Americans have realized they have a big gap, and that they need a lot of work on translator, how to train translators and interpreters fast. And I actually went to Monterey now 6 years ago to replace the people who left to go and work for the intelligence community. So, and my role at the time was to introduce translation theory and research.
How's that going?
It's difficult. It's difficult. It's difficult not because of the students. I find if I use this kind of material, it works. You know, students are very clever and very alert and keen to discuss these issues. But my colleagues are professional interpreters, professional translators, who only want that narrow sense of translation that we dealt with. Yeah.
We'll take one more question, and then we'll adjourn to the Aula Magna.
Phil Towner, NIDA Institute. I just want to make a comment, and I don't want to make my fellow American citizen angry here, but...
I'm not angry.
No. I appreciated what you said, but this is entirely of a different nature. The... what you were showing there of the insurgency brief or whatever, were those blocks actually quotations taken out of? Hearts and Minds and all that? And you identified Paul, Saul of Tarsus.
He's not cited in the document.
No. But was the block there? The reference to Hearts and Minds and so forth? And the reference to the force and resistance?
Yes, it's betrayal. It's his favorite phrase.
Okay. I was just a comment. The intertextuality there is interesting. You have Paul of Tarsus, perhaps, although that's mediated through, you know, common usage. But then you have Star Wars and Star Trek, and I wonder what kind of a commentary that is on the sort of discourse basis for building a document like that in the American context. But just a comment. Please.
Well, I'm not up to speed on Star Wars and Star Trek. Can you help me?
The Force will protect you.
The Force will protect you, yes. Right, okay.
And then you have resistance is pointless or resistance is futile, which comes from the Star Wars movie.
All right.
That's a Star Trek movie.
Sorry,
what a wonderful combination.
I'm outflanked here. Yeah. No, I just picked up the expression, the bad guys. You know, the bad guys. Just, you know, they are not people. It's the goodies and the baddies out there.
Well, we define them through very unique means, you know, our Hollywood films.
But look, otherwise, there's some very intelligent people that contributed to this document. It's not to denigrate it. It's just to point out that they contradict each other. That's all.
Thanks, Anthony. May the force be with you. Let's thank Anthony.